in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We've got a lot to cover, and of course, we've already had a chance to hear today from the Attorney General William Barr. We'll spend more time talking about that a little bit later, but expects to release the redacted version of the special counsel's report within about a week. Appeared before Congress really just to deal with some budget issues, but you knew where that was going to go very quickly. Them criticizing him for taking what now many people say is about 400 pages, summarizing it in about 4 pages, and convinced that there's some kind of redaction that will be taking place that they don't approve of. We'll get into some of the issues related to that a little bit later. And, of course, we're going to be talking about with one of our individuals that will be joining us next hour on the Congressional Prayer Caucus, and really encouraging you to pray for Congress in light of all the pieces of legislation they are considering right now, including the budget and much, much more. And so, as we like to do from time to time, we have a chance to talk with Representative Van Taylor, represents the 3rd Congressional District in the state of Texas, individual that has served in the past in the Texas House, the Texas Senate. Of course, he served in the military and joins us now by phone. Representative Van Taylor, it was great to see you the other night at the Lincoln Day dinner, and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Kirby, great to be on and great to be with all your listeners.
One of the pieces of legislation we talked about last time, and I'm not going to get into it in any great detail, we talked about that H.R. 1 bill that passed the House and moved on to the Senate. It's going nowhere. But
Sure.
The people in the, at least editors in the Wall Street Journal have said, you know, there's another piece of legislation called the Raise the Wage Act. And this would actually raise the nationwide minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now, that's passed out of the House Committee on Education and Labor. But I'd love to get your thoughts about not only the idea of a minimum wage, and then with people paying their taxes by next Monday, get into some tax issues. But there are concerns that I'll raise, and the first of them is that when you actually raise the minimum wage, we've seen this in Seattle. The example the editors of the Wall Street Journal used is some of the restaurants in New York. They're winners and losers. The winners are those who keep their jobs, but the losers are the ones that instead of getting a pay raise, get a pink slip, and all the other individuals that don't get a job, because when you raise the minimum wage so much, you begin to actually reduce the amount of jobs available. And they say, isn't it a coincidence that right now we are having a jobs recession in full-service restaurants in New York City? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so the Raise Your Wage Act was a really disappointing partisan thing, and what I heard from my Democrat colleagues over and over in the hearing where we voted on that, and I serve on the full committee, Education and Labor Committee, where that was voted on, and they kept saying over and over again, well, if you raise the minimum wage, we're not going to lose any jobs. No one's going to lose their jobs. No one's going to lose any income. We're not going to lose your jobs. And they said over and over again. And I actually held the bill up and said, I know you don't believe what you're saying because your bill tells me you don't believe what you're saying, because if you really believe what you're saying, you wouldn't stop at $15 an hour. You would go to $1,000 an hour. Because in theory, if I had a $1,000 minimum wage, no one would lose their job. And so why wouldn't you just do that? And I think you know that isn't true. And it was interesting. I actually spoke to some of my Democratic colleagues after the meeting, in private, and they said, "Well, yeah, you're probably right on that point." And
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, but going to data, I mean, so in Seattle, the city council passed a law, and it implemented minimum wage increases in different businesses at different points in time, going to $15 an hour. So it was gradual and depended on which business it was. But in one segment, they found that not only had they lost thousands of jobs, but furthermore, the incomes of the people that were lucky enough to keep their jobs actually declined. And you might ask, well, how is that possible? their wages are going up, wouldn't they earn more money? And the answer is no, because what employers would do is they would say you're not working overtime.
Right.
It's too expensive to pay you overtime. And so basically their hours were cut back, their overtime was basically eliminated. And so their income, the income of the people that were lucky enough not to get a pink slip, literally went down in a place where you had a $15, where you were shooting for a $15 minimum wage. And it just goes to it is ill-suited. I mean, most of the people who are in minimum wage jobs are it's their first job. It's a starter job. I know, my first job, working in a kitchen, washing pots and pans and baking, biscuits. It was a starter job. It was the beginning, the first rung in the ladder of opportunity, in the American ladder of opportunities. You climb your way up the ladder. And if you make a $15 minimum wage, you're taking a rung out of the ladder and making it that much harder for someone to reach up and to get that first rung. And you want to make it easy to get on that first rung, and you want to make it easy for people to climb up the ladder. And so, look, that bill is it actually hasn't come to the floor of the House yet, but and there's some discussion that the Democrats may not have the votes to actually move that piece of legislation off the floor of the House, but what you've seen so far in Friday will mark 100 days in Congress, and the last day we're voting is actually tomorrow when I get to go home, which is the best part of Washington. Let me just say that. That's where Washington.
Get to go home for spring break.
To go home, get away from this. And but the point is that the Democrats have passed literally no major legislation that is intended to be passed in the Senate and signed into law by the president. They are literally abdicating their responsibility to govern. I mean, their responsibility is to govern on a bipartisan basis. I mean, they're Democrats leading the U.S. House, but they're Republicans leading the U.S. Senate, and there's a Republican president. And so rather than working on a bipartisan basis to pass meaningful legislation that can make a difference in people's lives, in health care, in taxes, in regulations, in job creation, in trade, in our immigration system, we're having really serious problems in our immigration system. Instead, the Democrats are literally, you've heard me talk about this. I've learned a new term here in Washington, a messaging bill.
Messaging bill,
This is a bill that's designed to send a message. It's not designed to actually do anything or to pass into law. And the problem with that is it makes the legislation very sloppy because they're not paying attention to things, they're not dotting their I's and crossing their T's. And so you end up with legislation that's very vague, that's difficult to understand, and that can create a lot of really serious legal problems if they were to ever see the light of day and actually end up on the books as a real law.
Incredible. Let's take a break. Talking with Representative Van Taylor. I might just mention, if you say, wait a minute, I'd like to read some of this for myself, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. First of all, do a search, and you'll find, for example, I think back in June, I did a complete analysis of what was happening in Seattle. Next week, I have a commentary coming out called Fight for $15, and points out what has been documented now in New York City. And to make the point you just made a minute ago, the New York City Hospitality Alliance actually went out and talked to hundreds of eateries, and half of them said, yeah, okay, maybe if we have to raise $15 an hour, which that's what they had to do back in December, we'll just eliminate jobs, or we'll actually reduce the employee hours. And, of course, one other one, which I love to use in the state of Texas, but I got this actually from the Wall Street Journal. They said a cashier in New York, Texas, population 9, cannot be paid a dime less than $15 an hour due to New York City. So the other one doesn't even take into account the issue of cost of living. Let's take a break, though, because a lot of you are going to be paying your taxes. Matter of fact, they will be due next Monday. And there's some interesting comments about taxes surfacing in Congress right now as well. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Here's an important question. Will the courts determine the future of Obamacare? You might be excused for thinking the Supreme Court already decided that question, but there's another case that may affect the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the bill because of 4 liberal justices and Chief Justice John Roberts. Roberts argued that the mandate in the bill was a tax, and since the federal government has the power to tax, the Affordable Care Act was constitutional. Let's now fast forward to the Republican-controlled Congress when it considered the tax reform legislation known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They didn't eliminate the mandate, but they did zero out the penalty. That's when several states, through their attorneys general, filed suit claiming that the elimination of the tax penalty essentially invalidated Obamacare. Their argument was that removing the individual mandate caused the entire bill to collapse on itself. Back in December, U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor agreed with their argument and struck down both the mandate and the entire law. The case is now making its way through the courts and may eventually end up at the Supreme Court. It is certainly possible that the case won't get that far. Many legal experts believe that it was a huge legal leap for Judge O'Connor to invalidate the entire law, but in an unexpected move, the Justice Department has sided with the federal judge. It's worth mentioning that all of this will be taking place during an election year. Since the Republicans could not agree on a replacement plan when they were in power, that's why Democrats are already making a big issue out of health care during this election cycle. I would highly recommend that some members of Congress start talking about what a replacement might actually look like. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, in theaters Wednesday, April 17th. Point of View, Truth Team 360.
Hi, this is June Hunt from Hope for the Heart. Kirby and his guests are biblically based, and they bring a conservative voice to today's issues. I want to encourage you to honor this ministry with a special financial gift. You can do that at pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. And Kirby, I thank God for your ministry. You are needed in our world, because truth is needed in our hearts.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
I just mentioned last week we had our Truth Team Week, and that is a time in which we come to you and ask for your support of this organization and this ministry and this radio program. And even though we did focus on a lot of that last week, I thought I'd just mention that again. June Hunt encouraging you to support this ministry. And as you go to the website, pointofview.net, you'll see a banner there which allows you to join the Truth Team. And for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, you can be part of the Truth Team. But even a one-time gift, especially during this hour where we focus a lot on some of the issues happening not only in the state of Texas but nationwide, I hope that you will take the time to click on that button and help us out, because we had a good but not a great week, and we do have a financial need. So if you can help us out, we would greatly appreciate it. Representative Van Taylor with us, and as I have said on this program many times, either he's been on with us or not, I appreciate his intellect, I appreciate his dedication to the issues, his hard work, but I also appreciate his desire to try to reach across the aisle. And Van Taylor, last week, just a few days, I guess it's been almost a week now, you were joining with, and this is kind of encouraging to see that even something like this could happen, Elijah Cummings, who's a Democrat, Gerald Connolly, who's a Democrat, as well as Mark Meadows, who's a Republican, for at least an attempt in a bipartisan way to actually introduce legislation to protect federal workers. So as rare as that is, let's give credit where credit is due of trying to bring Democrats and Republicans together to do something.
Sure. No, I have spent a lot of time trying to get to know all my colleagues, and my Democrat and Republican both, And, I have been the lead Republican sponsor on actually 3 different bills that are authored by Democrats. I've actually co-sponsored 50 different bills. 33 were introduced by Democrats and 22 were introduced by Republicans. So I've made a point of trying to build those relationships, and where there are points of agreement, to try to cross the divide and continue to work on things. The legislation that you're referring to was about making sure that federal workers can still access health care during a shutdown. There are actually 6,000 federal workers in the 3rd Congressional District. And obviously, shutdowns, as you have heard me say, are a result of a very feeble budgeting system that the United States government put in the 1970s with the Budget Control Act. And since that went into effect in 1976, in 42 years, the federal government has actually had 21 shutdowns, which is an average of 1 every Congress. They have not been able to pass a budget on time in 16 years. And actually, today or tomorrow, we're supposed to vote on a budget cap bill because the Democrats have already admitted they can't put together a budget. And so the Budget Control Act that was passed in 1972, I think, is just empirically a complete failure. And it really has hampered the United States' ability as a federal government to pass a budget. They can't pass budgets to avoid shutdowns. They have shutdowns all the time. And it's very different than the state of Texas. The state of Texas has a single bill budget. They have passed every budget on time since 1963. It's usually on a bipartisan consensus basis. You don't necessarily agree with everything that's in it or how they did it, but, look, the last 2 budgets I voted on in the state Senate, there was 30 senators voted for it, 1 senator voted against. The budget that came out of the Texas House 2 weeks ago was 149-0. So you can have and that's a single bill budget system. So single bill budget systems is how most countries, most states, most counties, cities, school districts do single bill budgets. And so these shutdowns is a direct reflection of just a very poorly conceived budgeting system, and I do not think it's a reflection of the competency of the people that are in the Congress. They're operating within a system that just doesn't work. It's never worked, and that's not a indictment of Nancy Pelosi or Newt Gingrich or Tip O'Neill. It's an indictment of the Budget Control Act. It's just a piece of legislation that just really has just never worked.
Again, if you want to know a little bit more, vantaylor.house.gov. You don't even have to remember all that because you just click on where his picture is and we take you to his website and give you a lot of information there as well. And I appreciate your gracious comments about those people and their competence, but I did feel a lot more comfortable in the old days when we used to have people like Phil Gramm or Dick Armey in either the Senate or the House because they understood economics. And the other day when I had a presidential candidate in the Democratic side say, since people are getting lower refunds, that shows that the tax reductions really didn't take place. And I thought, really, you didn't just say that, did you? It caused then CBS News to say, wait a minute, lower refunds don't mean Americans paid more in taxes. Quite the opposite. And I think the fact is there's a little bit of economic confusion out there, which isn't helped by individuals who don't understand basic economics, didn't go to the kind of schools that you went to. And it just seems to me that we just need to help people not buy into this idea that just because your refund this year might be a little bit lower didn't mean that you paid lower in taxes. And it's amazing that even CBS News had to step in and say, no, wait a minute, that's not an accurate reflection. And so I thought for just a minute we might talk about taxes because next Monday, if people haven't already paid their taxes, they will. And you know as well as I do that there's a thing called Tax Freedom Day. And that's where you take all of the taxes collected each year and then divide it into the income earned and then look at the number of days. And interestingly enough, Tax Freedom Day occurs at the end of next week, right after we theoretically have to pay our taxes. And so it kind of illustrates, Representative Van Taylor, that we spend almost a fourth of our lives every single year trying to just support government. And I think we should get a pretty good bang for our buck. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I wish it was only a fourth. So in 1900, 8% of U.S. GDP went to government. It's now 42%
Yeah.
climb. and it's only a fourth. It's only 28% for the federal government.
Yes.
So,
we could add the cost of government day, which isn't until July. That's where you add in all the regulations and everything. That means you work more than half the year for the government. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, during the Obama administration, federal tax revenues were just over $2 trillion. In his 8 years, he increased it to almost $3.5 trillion. So you watched almost a 75% increase in total federal tax revenue in an 8-year period. And I don't think anybody's incomes went up 75% in that 8-year, or any substantial group of people. And so in addition to that, before the Obama administration added $1 trillion of regulations. And so the cost of his administration has been absolutely extraordinary on the American people. What's amazing is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which rolled back $1.5 trillion of new taxes, it rolled it back 10%. And if you listen to the Democrats, it's destroyed America and created the deficits, and it's just not the case. The 150, it's basically $150 billion per year tax cut, representing a few percentage points of total federal revenue. But look, at the end of the day, taxes. Government does not have a revenue problem. It has the most revenue it's ever had as a percentage of U.S. GDP. In the history of government, it has a spending problem. And the spending problem, again, stems from a very bad budgeting process that was implemented in 1976, the Budget Control Act. I mean, that particular piece of legislation, I know I keep coming back to it, but it really is core to the problem. We started having serious budget deficit problems starting in the early 80s. So shortly after we passed the Budget Control Act, we started having really serious problems with keeping our fiscal house in order. And I think until we reform that law, we're going to continue to have problems. And just so you know, I am working on that. I mean, I've only been here, I'll be 100 days on Friday, but I talk to a lot of my colleagues all the time, Republicans and Democrats, about this is a broken system, and you can all see it. And I'm going to try to get each successive generation of new members of Congress to see it's broken. The ones that like the system the way it is are the people at the top. It's a system that favors a very few number of people to be able to make a lot of decisions rather than distributing the power back down to the members themselves and putting them in charge. And the reason the Texas legislature, the reason their budgeting system works is because everybody has a seat at the table. They have to fight for what they want. They win some, they lose some. Everybody loses more than they win. And Democrats aren't in control, so they lose a little bit more. Republicans are in control. They win a little bit more. But, at the end of the day, they know the number that they can spend. They've come to an agreement on that, and they all vote for the budget.
Good. Representative Van Taylor, look forward to the next opportunity. Again, we have a link to vantaylor.house.gov. We'll be right back.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me give you just a bit of a preview here. In the next hour, we're going to be talking for a while with Rolf Carowin. His wife is one of the founders of the Congressional Prayer Caucus, and so we're going to spend some time talking about praying for Congress. And also, as we are thinking about this National Day of Prayer, that is an issue. Let me just mention for you Dallas listeners, by the way, that Alan West was with us last Monday. He will be speaking first of all, he's speaking this Thursday at the First Liberty Luncheon, and so they're going to let me go. And I think Dr. Merrill Matthews will be sitting here on Thursday, so I'll get a chance to hear him speak there. But more to the point, for the National Day of Prayer, Colonel Alan West will be speaking at the Hope Center, which is in Plano, and you are invited to attend. It's just a great opportunity to really have a time of prayer and to hear from some outstanding speakers. Of course, he's one of those, and so I just thought I might give you a little bit of a program note. We're going to see if Nick can mention that tomorrow as well. I'll try to mention it a little bit later as we get closer to that. Those of you that are in the Collin County area, the Collin County National Day of Prayer, now that's in the morning, so you're going to have to set your alarm for a lot earlier, but I'll be interviewing a few individuals that really talk about freedom. One that has received her freedom, if you will, by leaving Islam. The other receiving freedom by having escaped from Romania, who actually has been on the program with us before. And anyway, I just wanted to mention that one as well. So National Day of Prayer coming up. So we'll talk a bit about the Congressional Prayer Caucus. Then we're going to get into all sorts of issues. This whole issue of Chick-fil-A has exploded, but I wanted to wait till next hour to get into that, as well as a couple of other issues. We, of course, have an election taking place in Jerusalem, in Israel, so to get to that. But one of the articles we've posted here is by our good friend David French, Democrats Stop Delegitimizing Our Elections. And there is a sense in which whenever I talk about voter fraud, I really want to be real careful not to go to one extreme or the other. It's kind of like threading a needle, which kind of fits very well because I popped a button. So today I had to try to thread a needle, which I guess when you're in your late 60s is a little more difficult than it was in your 20s. But anyway, I was able to do that. But again, on the one hand, I don't want to go too far and say that there's no voter fraud, but you don't want to go the other situation, which is what David French is talking about, where people are claiming that voter fraud and voter suppression are the reasons that certain individuals are being elected. And his concern is he starts off by criticizing Donald Trump. He wants to be very fair about this, but then he spends most of his time talking about some of the Democrats who are delegitimizing our elections. And he says claims of voter fraud and voter suppression may excite a crowd, but our leaders are playing with fire. And so he talks about the fact that there are all sorts of people talking about stolen elections. Donald Trump, of course, won, but, of course, you may have seen, if you've looked at any of his tweets, because he has said it more than once, that in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. Okay, that was proven to be false back in November 27, 2016. But he just doubles down on it almost all the time, and he's got some links here. So if you'd like to read this article in its entirety, because I'm not, it is available on our website. And so it shows that certainly Donald Trump has been guilty of this, but most of the focus is what David French looks at in terms of the Democrats, because, as I've said before, if my team wins, is kind of the way this goes, then there's no voter fraud. If my team loses, well, then there's voter fraud, there's voter suppression, the system is rigged, and all of the rest. Now, in this case, Donald Trump won, and he still says the system is rigged. And I do believe that there is voter fraud. Is it enough that it's changed lots of elections? No. Has it changed some? I don't think you could argue against that. So you got to be real careful in how you say this. But nobody who is in positions of power right now, especially in the Democratic Party, are being very careful to, back to my phrase, thread the needle. Let's take Hillary Clinton. Now, again, she's not so much in power, but she was, of course, running for the presidency on 2 separate occasions, served as 8 years as the First Lady, married to a man who served as president for 8 years. So you would think she'd be a little more careful about what she says. Here's a direct quote. Hillary Clinton said, "I was the first person who ran for president without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. I'll tell you, it makes a big difference. And it doesn't just make a difference in Alabama and Georgia. It made a difference in Wisconsin, where the best studies that have been done said somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people were turned away from the polls because of the color of their skin, because of their age, because of whatever excuse could be made up to stop a fellow American citizen from voting." Really? I mean, that one is breathtaking in its claim. And you can certainly say that even if there were a fraction of a percent of those individuals who indeed were turned away because of the color of their skin, this would be front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post. It would be an investigative report by 60 Minutes. It would be covered time and time and time again. But don't take my word for it. Let's go to the Washington Post. Glenn Kessler does a pretty good job. Every once in a while I disagree with him, but most of the time he's really one of the better fact-checking people out there. And first of all, he says that the Voting Rights Act, you might say, what is that, by the way? Okay, a little history lesson. Civil Rights Act, 1964. Voting Rights Act, 1965. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act didn't even apply to Wisconsin. So first of all, it's not even accurate in that regard, because the Voting Rights Act only applies to, in general, certain states, mostly southern, certain localities, certain precincts. Okay, so first of all, it did not apply to Wisconsin, and so the whole premise of her comment is wrong. Then voting registration would affect Georgia, but voter registration actually increased in 2016. And as a matter of fact, while there was a general decline in black turnout in the nation in 2016, it's interesting that, and that happened with or without voter ID laws, it increased dramatically in the state of Georgia. Why? Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Stacey Abrams. But nevertheless, Kessler in the Washington Post gave Hillary Clinton's claim. First of all, he said it's wrong on multiple levels, seriously misleading, and worth a cumulative 4 Pinocchios. You don't get too many 4 Pinocchios in the Washington Post. So that's how bad that one was. Okay, one more just to get the point across. Elizabeth Warren, she made some of the same claims that massive voter suppression prevented Stacey Abrams, who I just referred to a minute ago, from becoming the rightful governor in Georgia. They know that a durable majority of Americans believe in the promise of America, and they know that all votes are counted, will win every single time. So again, this argument that the election was stolen from Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and again, maybe I should cover some of this when we are actually being heard in Georgia, but nevertheless, again, this argument of there being massive voter suppression is not well documented at all. As a matter of fact, as we just pointed out a minute ago, there were actually more individuals voting than before. Almost 2.5 million Georgia citizens voted in the 2014 gubernatorial election. By 2018, that was 3.9 million, and she received 1.9 million votes and still lost, interestingly enough. And so you can see that if you even compare it to 2014, the Republican governor actually had 1.3 million votes and won. So again, a lot of people say, well, okay, even if the numbers went up, isn't it possible that there was suppression? And again, you can look at the question about purged voters and all the rest. But again, the individual that beat her, of course, Kemp, won by almost 55,000 votes. So the argument, he says here, is that but for the purges and pending registrations where voters could register and vote nonetheless, Abrams would have netted additional votes by the tens of thousands. There is zero, as he says, meaningful support for this claim. I'll let you read it in its entirety, but the point he's making is that on the one hand, I don't want to dismiss voter fraud, because we do have examples of that. We have individuals that are being put in jail for that, people that have been fined for that. And so when you hear like the Brennan Center or certain Democrats say there's no voter fraud, that's not accurate. But then when you have some of these now leading Democrats are saying that if there wasn't voter fraud or voter suppression, our candidates would have won. That's not right either. And actually doing a great deal to harm the mindset of individuals. Because I've had people call on this program saying, well, the whole system is rigged, and so if the system is rigged, why should I vote? You can see the problem with that one, too, can't you? So there are some really significant concerns. So that's one of the reasons I've posted that article. I think it's the third article today. Delegitimizing our elections. We have to be careful how we talk about voter fraud, but on the other hand, this constant drumbeat lately that's come, especially from leaders in the Democrat Party, that are saying the reason we lost some of these elections, the presidential election or the Georgia election, is because of voter suppression. Zero evidence for it. And again, don't take my word for it. Just read about it in the Washington Post. When you get 4 Pinocchios, you can't lie any worse than that. We'll be right back.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
And in the absence of resources like Point of View and the silencing of the church, I think it would in effect create the silencing of the church. And this is why, again, it is so essential that that forums like Point of View is so vital to the work of the church. And this is where listeners can be an active participant in spreading the gospel of the kingdom by supporting Point of View.
Without programs like Point of View, ministries and works would not have a forum that reaches the populations that need to hear the truth about the very important issues that America is founded on. So often we take what we hear for granted, the radio program or the wonderful personalities. But you know, they can only be on if people like you and me support them.
Point of View. Truth Team 360.
Back once again, and again, we are encouraging you, if you have not supported this ministry, to take the time to visit our website, pointofview.net. You'll see a banner there, and it's an opportunity for you to join with us. And especially during this hour, from 12 to 1, I recognize we have some listeners outside of the state of Texas, but the majority of our audience, at least this particular hour, before we go on our national broadcast at 1 o'clock, is primarily Texas, and especially the Dallas area. So I would certainly love to hear from some of you that have been listening to this program for a length of time, for example, on the local station, 1160 AM, but even for those of you that are in Minnesota and a number of you that listen online or listen as a podcast. Your contribution this hour would be something that would say, hey, we don't have many people call in during this hour. I understand that. Only a fraction of a percent of people ever call a talk show. Have I ever called a talk show? I think I've only done that once or twice myself. So I understand that. But this is a way in which you can say, I'm out here listening. I haven't called in. Maybe I've never sent an email, never done anything, but at least you could send a one-time gift, and that's a way that we know that you're listening and appreciate what we're talking about here on Point of View. So again, you can go to the website, which is pointofview.net, or some of you might say, hey, I'd just like to talk to someone right now. We have individuals that do answer the phone, 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. And I'll say more about our Truth Team event when we get into the national program. But let me go to one of our other articles that I've listed here today, which is entitled Leftist Judge Declares Immigration Policy. Now, whatever you think about our immigration policy, the answer to what we should do is that this should be duly debated and considered by Congress in both the House of Representatives and the Senate and signed by the president. That's how we make laws. Remember when you used to take a civics class? And that's how we told you that a law was proposed. It then goes to committee. We just heard about this when Van Taylor talking about the Education and Labor Committee that he was sitting on. Then it's passed out of committee and it's going to be voted on. And this particular piece of legislation he was talking about in the House of Representatives, and then it'll be sent to the Senate, where it won't go any further. I'm not even sure it's going to pass the House of Representatives, but we'll see. But again, we have pieces of legislation that do pass the House, pass the Senate, signed by the president, things like the Affordable Care Act, good example of that, Tax Reform Act, some of those. But what we are starting to have are unelected judges who are appointed for life, who, because they have a leftist perspective, want to do anything they can to thwart the president, not because the president's policy is wrong, but simply because they dislike him. And so we had a situation yesterday where a federal judge blocked an experimental Trump administration policy that requires asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases make their way through the immigration court system. Instead, as a major blow to President Trump, as border crossings have surged to their highest level in more than a decade, the U.S. District Court Judge Richard Seaberg in San Francisco, no surprise there, it's either San Francisco, Seattle, or Honolulu, Hawaii, usually where they get somebody that's going to do that, enjoyed the migrant protection protocols policies days after the outgoing Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen pledged to expand the program. Now, whatever you think of the program, which, by the way, I think in the broad details makes sense to me. Maybe there's some things in the smaller parts that I would disagree with. What we've always had as a policy in terms of not just government policy in the federal government, international policy is if you are leaving a country where you are being persecuted, where you've been targeted for assassination, the next country that you get into where you are no longer threatened, that's where you seek asylum. So let's assume for a minute that all these, quote, asylum seekers, can I use air quotes on this? Because I do believe that a number of them are just simply using the law to try to get into this country. But let's assume that in Honduras, you've been targeted by a drug hit squad or something. You leave Honduras, you make it into Mexico. There's where you ask for asylum. But they don't do that. They just keep running through or going through that. In some cases, they're going maybe from Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, whatever. They've gone through multiple countries before they get to Mexico. Then they make this very long trek all the way from Mexico to the American border and then ask for asylum. So the argument is, okay, if you're asking for asylum, let's stay in Mexico, because what happens is when you come here for asylum, we don't have enough people at the border right now. We don't have enough facilities at the border right now. So we have to say, well, okay, we have to consider your case. Come back 3 weeks from now so we can consider your asylum case. And then we release them into the general population, and they're never heard from again. We know how the game's getting played. So if nothing else, this is obviously a program that makes some sense. But even if you think it's a terrible program, guess what? That's not the decision of one judge in San Francisco to make. And I love what this particular piece by Mike Ford is. This obviously unconstitutional ruling prohibits President Trump's program of requiring asylum seekers to wait in Mexico for their hearings, as opposed to allowing them to disappear into the interior of the United States, never to be seen again unless caught committing a murder or a kidnapping. And so this is what is many times been referred to as lawfare. In other words, it's warfare using the law. Let's go judge shopping. And as we have had people ask questions on this program so many times, how can one federal judge in Hawaii, in Washington, or in this case in the state of California, overturn a policy made by the President of the United States through his administration, which no doubt probably took the time to craft the policy? And that has been used time and time again against George W. Bush. So when it finally was used against Barack Obama, when he had both DACA and DAPA. DAPA was kind of set aside by a judge in the state of Texas. And then all of a sudden everybody's screaming and crying out and everything. And I had to at least smile, because I disagree with even a federal judge in Texas being able to challenge the president and any more. And of course, now you have a federal judge that's challenged the whole issue of Obamacare, which is my commentary today. So I want to be consistent and say it makes no sense to me that one federal judge can stop the president of the United States, can stop a congressional piece of legislation that was passed by Congress and signed by the president. And so this has got to stop, because right now everybody's applauding this because they don't like Donald Trump. But just consider what happens later with you when you have maybe a President Kamala Harris or whoever that might be, President Joe Biden, and then you can see the Democrat judges will just do that to him. And this is not the way to run a government. So that's why I posted that piece. And if you'd like to read it in its entirety, it's on the website pointofview.net. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about praying for this nation for a while, and then we'll get into some of the issues of the Mueller report and taxes and Chick-fil-A and a variety of other issues. We've got a lot to cover today. But let's take a break, and when we go to a break, that is a perfect time for you to go to our website, pointofview.net. Join the Truth Team at any level. We'd greatly appreciate your financial support, and we'll be right back.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me, spending some time today looking at a variety of different issues. A little bit later this hour, spend some time talking about the release of the Mueller report. Some of the comments made today by the Attorney General William Barr. We'll get into that. Also, of course, we have to pay our taxes, and it's been interesting to hear some of the comments being made about taxes. We also have posted some articles about the ongoing battle with Chick-fil-A, so we'll get into that certainly within the next 2 hours, and also some articles I've posted on Democrats trying to delegitimize our elections. David French has comments about that. Of course, also is critical of Donald Trump and some of the things he said. So he's an equal opportunity grief giver in that regard. So we have a lot to cover in the next couple of hours. But what I want to try to do, first of all, is to really encourage you, number one, to be praying for those in authority. And we're going to be talking with an individual whose wife was one of the co-founders of the Congressional Prayer Caucus. Of course, we've had Congressman Randy Forbes on, who was one of the other co-founders, but also he's developed some social media that you may want to use and might find encouraging as well. And as we're kind of getting ready for this National Day of Prayer, that will certainly be the case. I might just mention that an individual that actually introduced me to my next guest is Colonel Alan West, who was with us last Monday. Also is going to be speaking at the National Day of Prayer in at the Hope Center in Dallas area, and also will be speaking next, matter of fact, just a couple days from now for First Liberty Institute. So we'll get some update from him as well. But let's, if I can, introduce my first guest, and that is Rolf Carawan, who is a seasoned consultant in the corporate world, a strategic trainer, planner, motivational speaker, executive coach. His wife is one of the co-founders of the Congressional Prayer Caucus. But also we want to talk about his organization called All Social, which I think you're going to find very helpful in terms of getting good information, prayer targets, and maybe getting out from under some of the thumbs of those individuals that control your data and information and sometimes censor it. So, Rolf, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kirby, I'm so grateful for you and for your voice out there in the marketplace, brother. Thank you for having us.
The other day I was walking by, Alan West said hi to him. He introduced me to you, and I said, we need to get you in studio, but you're not in studio today. You're by phone, but maybe we'll do that in the future because you were in the Dallas area. But first of all, let's talk about your wife, a very gifted individual indeed, graduate of University of Washington, also with a master's degree in theology from Regent University. But she and Randy Forbes put together this Congressional Prayer Caucus, and we have a link to that on our website at cpcfoundation.com, but people don't even have to remember that because we have a link there, and I would encourage people to join with them. Number one, to pray. Number two, to understand what are some of the key religious liberty issues, because you post many good articles in that regard. But give us a little bit of the background, because that connects up to, of course, your organization, All Social, doesn't it?
Well, thank you, Kirby. There is basically a disconnect on one little part. Leah has been the executive director for the foundation. Actually, Congressman Forbes and another Democratic congressman from North Carolina established the caucus. It was an official U.S. caucus in the House there some years ago. But they saw the need for creating a foundation that could take basically the principles that they were learning and utilizing which was the power of their voices collectively coming against some of the lies and some of the basically attacks of the anti-faith, anti-God organizations that were trying to bully people in the marketplace and in their positions of authority. So Congressman Forbes put this thing together in the caucus, and they got the foundation started. And now the foundation, Leah, through her leadership and Randy's leadership, have basically been able to create, I think, 40 caucuses now on the state level.
Yes.
Where these different individuals, leaders, elected leaders, are coming together, want to pray for one another, encourage one another, but primarily to fight for our religious liberties. And so they are passing legislation left and right to ensure our first freedom, which is the freedom of expression. And so that's what they've been working hard for. And it does indirectly impact what we're doing with All Social, but there is just a little bit of a distance there.
Well, certainly. And let me just mention, because I want to get on to your organization in just a minute, that when you go to the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, one of the things they have is a section, a drop-down menu on religious liberty issues. Now, you've heard us talk about that with Kelly Shackelford. Matter of fact, Kelly Shackelford will be with us Friday, as well as Jeremy Dice. And oftentimes we have Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter, and if we don't have them, we have some other individuals that really talk about what they're doing in the courts. But here is another action item of what's happening in various legislatures, and you'll see religious liberty and the current health care system, religious liberty in the marketplace, religious freedom in the public schools, and even the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, something I'll be talking about a little bit later in more detail, because it surfaced with the former Governor Mike Pence, now the Vice President, and some of the counterpoint between him and the mayor of South Bend, who's now running for the presidency. So we'll get into all of that. But those are some great resources there, and if you'd like to join with them and certainly use these resources for your National Day of Prayer that you might be doing locally, or certainly encouraging your church to do so, that is the case. And so, again, Leah Carawan is, of course, one of the co-founders, but we're talking right now with Rolf. Talk about allsocial.com, because this is kind of a new social media platform, and there might be some reasons why people would say, why do we need a different social media platform? Can you explain why?
Absolutely, Kirby. Thank you again. And we do appreciate your audience getting out there and getting involved with Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation and the need for prayer, but really to stand up for their first freedoms. It's part of that same principle and spirit that we got involved more and more in creating allsocial.com, which is available to everybody right now. You can certainly go to your web browser and just type in allsocial.com and join us, or you can download the app at the either app store, whatever you've got, an Android or a iPhone or whatever, and just be part of the All Social family and crowd to start entering into the conversation. The owners of All Social have been, Kirby, in the social media space 7 or 8 years now. And as they've worked within this space and been very close of wanting to have a voice in the marketplace to ensure that all of our viewpoints are heard, saw that there were increasing numbers of social media platforms that were starting to restrict people's opinions, their speech, finding out that they couldn't use certain words. People with certain viewpoints were learning that they were being what they call shadow banded, which means that basically the messages they were trying to put out to their audience that they had created was not getting to their audience. And people were actually being banned. I'm sure you've heard of some of those.
Let me take a break, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about that, because I think most people are aware of that. We've talked with everybody from Dennis Prager all the way down to a variety of other individuals with the National Religious Broadcasters about what's happening. So, do you have an alternative? Yes, we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You're here's an important question. Will the courts determine the future of Obamacare? You might be excused for thinking the Supreme Court already decided that question, but there's another case that may affect the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the bill because of 4 liberal justices and Chief Justice John Roberts. Roberts argued that the mandate in the bill was a tax, and since the federal government has the power to tax, the Affordable Care Act was constitutional. Let's now fast forward to the Republican-controlled Congress when it considered the tax reform legislation known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They didn't eliminate the mandate, but they did zero out the penalty. That's when several states, through their attorneys general, filed suit claiming that the elimination of the tax penalty essentially invalidated Obamacare. Their argument was that removing the individual mandate caused the entire bill to collapse on itself. Back in December, U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor agreed with their argument and struck down both the mandate and the entire law. The case is now making its way through the courts and may eventually end up at the Supreme Court. It is certainly possible that the case won't get that far. Many legal experts believe that it was a huge legal leap for Judge O'Connor to invalidate the entire law. But in an unexpected move, the Justice Department has sided with the federal judge. It's worth mentioning that all of this will be taking place during an election year. Since the Republicans could not agree on a replacement plan when they were in power, that's why Democrats are already making a big issue out of health care during this election cycle. I would highly recommend that some members of Congress start talking about what a replacement might actually look like. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, in theaters Wednesday, April 17th. Point of View, Truth Team 360.
Hey, greetings, everyone. This is Lieutenant Colonel retired Alan West, former member of the 112th Congress. I just want to take a few moments to tell you why it's so important that you support Kirby and what he's doing here with Point of View Ministries and all the great people they have here on this team. This is truly an intersection of the culture. It is truly a place where you can have that open discussion about politics, your faith, and all the things that are affecting our country with the current issues, but it is always from a biblical perspective. And I think that's what makes Point of View Ministries, Point of View Radio, and what Kirby brings in his analysis and his assessment so very important. So please continue to support Point of View Ministries, Point of View Radio. What a great ministry, what a great man, what a great team that you have here at Point of View Ministries and Point of View Radio. Make sure that you support them.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
Good friend Colonel Alan West, who's not only been a guest with us, matter of fact, last week, but has also been a guest host sitting in this chair and probably will do so again. We cross paths with him quite often. As a matter of fact, Thursday, I'm going to have a chance to hear him speak at the First Liberty Luncheon that's happening in Dallas. So that is a good opportunity. And he's the one that introduced me to Rolf right now. So there's a connection there. Let me just mention real quickly, since this is the first day I've been back, yesterday Penna was covering the show, and I want to thank her for doing that we last week did our Truth Team Week. And if you have not had a chance to join with us, of course, we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring programs like this to you. So go to the website, pointofview.net. You can click on that button that says Join the Team Now. And if you did not have a chance to join with us, we would love to hear from you. even a one-time gift would be greatly appreciated. This is a way for you just to say, look, I don't have a lot of money, but, I do get some benefit from some of the things that you're talking about here. And so let me just at least send a one-time gift. Of course, I'm hoping that some of you will join the Truth Team. That's for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year. And of course, there are lots of benefits that we give to you, the Outlook magazine, as well as our Bible stick that we send to you. And of course, at the higher levels, we have these new booklets that come out every single month. Here's some of the ones dealing with things like immigration, messianic prophecy. The most recent one, which will be in the mail to those of you that join at higher levels, is on the subject of anti-Semitism. And of course, we're talking right now with Rolf about this issue of religious liberty. So, Rolf, let's again come back to this, because one of the reasons you did this was you now have an app which people can use, for example, to encourage other fellow Christians, other conservatives. There are prayer targets. There's other information. So talk about what actually is there if somebody logs on or gets an app for their phone. What's available for them?
Yeah, thank you, Kirby. Actually, it's a social platform, much like many of the other social platforms. We created it so that it would be for everybody, because we want to have a conversation with all of America to make sure that they can get on and express their particular views, and that we can share our views. And whatever your particular view is, you don't have to worry about being banned, and you don't have to worry about watching everything you say. So we've created this platform that you can take things from Facebook, Twitter. You can take it from YouTube. YouTube, you've got a video there. You want to place it on All Social, or All Social can be your originator of content. And so that you're basically just grabbing your family and friends, coming over to All Social and have the communication there, because there's several things that really make us unique, Kirby. One of the biggest things that a lot of people have talked about is privacy, and we have a 100% guarantee that your data will never be sold. And I know that's been an issue for, if you've been watching the news at all with some other platforms. Number two, like we said, you're free to express your opinions, your ideas, your hopes, your dreams. And thirdly, and maybe most importantly for individuals and especially influencers like yourself, is that once you've created your audience, people that are Kirby fans and want to be a part and be a part of your audience, then 100% of what you post will be shared with your people, rather than your reach being cut, in half and then a quarter and then 1 or 2% or whatever that many of the social platforms are doing, and then charging you to talk to your people. We're going to make sure that everybody in your audience actually gets what you send out.
Well, again, those 2 points are probably enough to convince almost everybody. Privacy, number one. Where is my name going to be sold? How is Google or whoever it might be, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, or whatever, using my data? And in some respects, when they make it available for free, they're using you as the product and selling it to others. And so it's not surprising that if I go to a particular website and look at camera equipment or fishing equipment or whatever it might be, the next day all sorts of stuff pops up on my website, and I go, oh, well, it's pretty obvious that they're kind of looking over my shoulder and probably selling it to that or providing links to it. So the privacy issue is really key for a lot of our listeners. And I've told you before, Rolf, that we even have individuals that call into this program, and then when I go and meet them, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in Alaska, whether it's in California, whether it's in Illinois, I find out that they actually don't give me their real name because they're wondering, who's monitoring those kinds of things. So first of all, the privacy issue is big, but even bigger for those of us that are trying to have an outreach. I'm virtually convinced that my Twitter account is shadow banned because I will post simultaneously my commentaries. And my commentary today is about this case before the federal courts on the issue of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. And when I posted on Facebook, oh, my goodness, all sorts of comments and all sorts of things. I posted on Twitter. I'm lucky if I get a like, or a heart or anything, which tells me, it's not going anywhere. And so just the fact that I can't even use the so-called public forums to reach the people that would like to really read what I am making available free of charge in terms of research and content is just another good reason for people to find out a little bit more about All Social. So what's involved? Because people might say, okay, what's the catch? It's got to be something here. So what does that involve?
You know, all it is going and signing up. You can basically, we just need your email address to ensure that you are a real person and not a robot. So every account has its own unique email address. And then you have your password, and then that's it. You go in, you start posting. You can do some searches to find out who is there. We've even be coming up with some mileposts here pretty soon where we're going to be able to offering our family and friends how to basically invite their family and friends and be a part of All Social. There really is no catch. You know, the beauty of it is it's free just like all of it. And Kirby, you just mentioned something that I think is incredibly important, especially for those of us who really feel strongly about our viewpoint. The ability to speak into the marketplace and to express one's view is becoming maybe coalesced, if you will, into the hands of just a very few corporations, news organizations and things. And there has to be disintermediaries out there that can share the reality or the truth of what's going on. And so basically that's the reason that we created All Social, is to give people an alternative to what they're currently seeing. And I just ask you, do you think it's going to get any better as far as people curtailing your speech?
Probably not. You know, we years ago had Craig Parshall on. He's married to Janet Parshall, in case people see the similarity of names, and he was the lawyer for National Religious Broadcasters, and he was noticing years ago, almost a decade ago now, that some of that was starting to happen with what was allowed in the Apple Store, what was happening in Facebook, what was happening in Twitter, and those kinds of things. And of course, since then, guess what? It's just gotten worse. So when I first heard that you had developed something, Rolf, as we're coming to a break, let me just mention that we're going to move on to some other topics, but I just thought this is what people keep saying, you know, when they hear about this. Well, can we provide an alternative to Google, Facebook, Twitter, whatever? Well, here's an alternative. So go check it out, and we've got a link to it right there on our website, pointofview.net. So I appreciate you giving us some time to talk about that. And hey, next time you're in Dallas, let's get you in studio and we can chat a little bit more about some of these issues of religious liberty that we need to really approach and really develop and educate our listeners about. So, Rolf, thanks for being with us today here on Point of View.
Well, Kirby, again, thank you, and thank you for all that you're doing to literally keep your voice open in America.
allsocial.com, and you have a link there, and you can find out a little bit more about him. But I wanted to move on to some other topics, one of which, of course, is what about the Mueller report? But more importantly, I want to spend some time, since almost everybody now is writing about Chick-fil-A, and some are even saying, okay, we have to keep this in some kind of balance, which is what we're going to do. But at the same time, I just think it is time for maybe us to think about what we can do to support an organization that is being vilified almost every day in different venues. And when you have 3 different articles just on my desk here about Chick-fil-A, you can see that it's become an issue that we need to talk about. We will do so right after this.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your health care. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again. Let's, if we can, focus on some of the issues in the news. I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Real briefly, I wanted to at least explain the Mueller report, because sometimes people don't understand exactly kind of what's happening behind the scenes. Today, the Attorney General actually announced that he expects to release the redacted version of the special counsel's investigation of the Trump-Russia collusion investigation within about a week. Now, the report, which we are now being told is nearly 400 pages long, is being scoured at the moment to remove any grand jury information or details that relate to any pending investigation. And I wanted to help you, again, be a good news consumer and have some discernment, because what you're going to hear people say is, well, why can't we have the full report? And first of all, I've been one of those that says I'm all for having as much of that report out there as possible. But I do understand why you would have to redact certain grand jury investigations or information. Allegations could be made that are proven false, but if you just see them without all of the context, you might say, well, hey, wait, what about this? Or, of course, some of it could actually relate to pending investigations. Some of it might, in one way or another, threaten national security. After all, since this does involve, another country, Russia, and other actors, there could be some concerns there. But the bigger issue, and the Attorney General William Barr explained this today, that actually there is a law that was passed during the Clinton administration, who was a Democrat, passed in part by supporters that were Democrats, to prevent any kind of unredacted special counsel report from being released. And so I've asked a few people if they can remember why they did that. And most of the time they don't. So unless you're kind of a news junkie, or of course for a lot of you listeners, you weren't alive then, or you weren't paying attention back then, it turns out that the previous investigation, which was done by a man by the name of Ken Starr, the Starr investigation, released all of that. And the Democrats were furious. I think legitimately so, by the way. I'm not disagreeing necessarily with it, because it went into a fair amount of detail about the sexual activities of then President Bill Clinton. If I were to even read parts of that report on the air right now, you would hear this click from radio stations all down our network saying, "Woo." I'd also probably get a notice from the FCC about some of the things that were said. So there was a reason for why we actually have legislation that prevents the unredacted reports coming out, and that was done in large part because of the reaction to what happened when the last time we had an unredacted report coming out. So nevertheless, of course, this is but my argument has always been, let's have as much of the report that comes out as possible, because there's always these allegations. And this came the other day from one of the people that was chairing the House Appropriations Committee, that how in the world could you take a 400-page document, summarize it in a 4-page letter in 2 days? Well, first of all, anybody ever go to college, even in high school, where you had to read a book and then had to summarize it in a couple of pages? And you know what it took, but it is possible to do so. And nevertheless, you can see what the point was. And even today in the testimony, the Attorney General William Barr said the thinking of the special counsel was not a mystery to the Department of Justice prior to the submission of the report. In other words, we kind of knew what was coming down anyway. We already knew what was happening. And so that is the case, that you will get a redacted report. But all this hue and cry about we want the report now and we want it unredacted, first of all, isn't going to happen. One, because the law prevents it. Number two, because it could, in one way or another, affect some of the grand jury investigation, maybe even affect certain kinds of investigations, and won't happen. So no matter what is provided, it will never be enough. But again, those, I think, are political talking points. But for those out there, and there are many that say, why should they release the report at all? I just like to turn it around, as I always do. Imagine if it was completely reversed, and in this particular case, you had a Democratic appointed attorney general for a Democrat president who said, no, this 4-page summary is sufficient, don't you think the Republicans would be saying, no, we want to see the original report? So I recognize that there is a desire to see that, but I think what we will probably find is, because William Barr seems like a very fair individual, is that 4-page summary is probably a very good, accurate summary of what is in the report. But, we'll find out. It's a lot of hue and cry about some other things we're not going to pay a lot of attention to. And for just a few minutes, I do want to pay some attention to Chick-fil-A. And I'd love to get your comments about this, because the editors of the National Review have decided to write about this. Rich Lowry has written about this, and Jim Garrity's written about this. Okay, everybody's writing about it, right? What started out at about 2 weeks ago as a local story for those of us on our local hour in San Antonio has kind of become a national story, because, as the editors point out, first you had the city council in San Antonio banning this because of the words of the councilman there. Everyone should feel welcome when they walk through the airport. Then a little bit later, you have the New York Democratic Assemblyman announcing that the Buffalo airport would prohibit Chick-fil-A from operating in its food court as well. And part of the reason for that, interestingly enough, is not just for the fact that they're seen as anti-LGBTQ, which they're not, by the way, but we're going to get into that in just a minute. But the fact is that there was a group called Think Progress, which has been around for a while, pointing out that some of these contributions have gone to groups that some of the gay activists don't like as well. Now, if this sounds like deja vu, it should, because in this particular article, the editors of the National Review remind us back in 2012, a wave of Democratic city officials, including the mayors of Boston and San Francisco, threatened to block Chick-fil-A from opening restaurants in their cities. And then you had this huge attempted boycott, which led to a response of a boycott of show of support. And you might remember, if you were listening on this program back then, I would have had many of you calling in from Tennessee and Kentucky and Illinois and California and Georgia and North Carolina, telling me about the long lines out in front of Chick-fil-A. And so, if nothing else, we may be coming into that particular situation as well. So I did my part today. I don't go to Chick-fil-A very often, but I went to Chick-fil-A today. And I think it's maybe good for some of you that say, wait a minute, I appreciate their stand on moral issues, and I appreciate the fact that even though they're being criticized for giving donations to the Salvation Army, really, the Salvation Army, and Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Again, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, about not a very political organization, but nevertheless, that maybe we should go and buy a sandwich from them, get a salad, and say, well, thank you for your stand. And that would be something I would recommend, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But back to the point, the editors in the National Review say, first and foremost, it is plainly and clearly unconstitutional for government officials to punish private corporations for the political or religious views of their owners and affiliates. And this is one of the reasons why, if you fly through the Denver airport, even though the Denver City Council tried to shut down Chick-fil-A, there were a number of attorneys that sat down with the City Council and said, I hate to tell you this, but you are going to end up having to fight a First Amendment lawsuit, and you will lose. So they finally backed down on that. So the first point is that. Second of all, it says it's worth pointing out that the sheer extremism and intolerance of San Antonio and Buffalo's actions, Chick-fil-A is being punished not for giving money to political or culture war organizations, but rather for donations to Salvation Army, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and a small donation to a youth home. I didn't know that one until I read this article. The result is a declaration by government actors that even the most mainstream of traditional Christian organizations should be officially marginalized. Groups that are instrumental in the lives of the poor and the lives of American youth are too toxic even for private donations, and donors should face economic punishment for having the audacity to support the charity of their choice. So when we come back from the conversation, we're going to spend a little bit more time looking at some of the commentaries that have come out. Rich Lowry says, here is a great example of a McCarthyite anti-Christian campaign. And then Jim Garrity says, we have bigger problems to tackle than some of these culture war politics. And I will agree. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the whole Chick-fil-A issue, although it is an issue. But I recognize We don't have to totally ignore it. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can talk about some of the things happening in Chick-fil-A, as well as talk about all these other issues that are before Congress and before the president, including very important issues related to immigration and a variety of other judicial decisions. So we'll come back and kind of give you a counterpoint on that. But I'd love to hear your comments as well. Is it worth supporting Chick-fil-A? Do you feel like the campaign against them is unfair and maybe unlawful? I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
My name is Kwasi Agbota. I heard this for the first time driving through Alabama 5 minutes ago as I'm returning to Detroit. I was very touched. It stands out as timeless in its approach. I greatly appreciated that. I was moved by it, and so I called to give my testimony. And I was very curious about a lot of the same issues and timeless truth and contemporary application. So I thank God for what you all are doing, and I want to encourage you all that you are reaching perhaps a much broader audience than you might believe. God bless you.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
Someone called in a while back just to give their testimony, a first-time listener, and we had a first-time listener just even last week during our Truth Team that gave to the ministry. So if you have been listening to the program for a long time, maybe even years, and have never given, let me encourage you to consider what you might do to simply visit the website, pointofview.net, click on that banner, join the Truth Team. Even a small gift would be greatly appreciated. As I've shared before, just a fraction of the percent of individuals that ever listen to this program call into it, but still a fraction of a percent are those who ever give to this program. And so if you are one of those 99+%, maybe a first-time gift would be a great way of encouragement. If you'd like to join us, though, let me open up the phones to 1-800-351-1212. That's the on-air line. And this is an issue I want to put on the table for a few more minutes because it has to do with the issue of Chick-fil-A, but the broader issue of how much we want to go down the road. And Rich Lowry, in the piece that I'm quoting from right now, calls it the McCarthyite anti-Christian campaign against Chick-fil-A, pointing out, of course, that we've had the situation first in San Antonio and now in Buffalo, New York. And, of course, as the editors of the National Review talk about, it even goes back and harkens back to something that happened in 2012. And one of the things that Rich Lowry reminds us of is that Chick-fil-A obviously is not refusing anybody's service. He said it didn't become the fastest growing restaurant chain in America, projected to take third place in sales after McDonald's and Starbucks by putting obstacles between hungry patrons and its sandwiches. He says, except on Sundays when it's closed. You know, that's really amazing, too. Is Starbucks closed on Sunday? No. Is McDonald's closed on Sunday? No. And it's number 3. I mean, whoa. I mean, that just is amazing to me. And when we look at Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A, and a variety of other Christian-owned companies, look how successful they have been. But he brings us back to the bigger point, and it's something that Jim Garrity speaks to as well. He says, needless to say, other people are guilty of the same offense. If indeed you are offended because they have given donations to the Salvation Army or to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes or a small Christian home for troubled youth in Georgia, which I did not know about until I read some of these articles, obviously a lot of other people are guilty of this offense, given the fact that the Salvation Army raises about $2 billion a year. To consider all that the Salvation Army does, Rich Lowry says, it's thrift shops, aid for the homeless, disaster relief, anti-trafficking programs, Christian gifts to needy children, and much, much more, and reduce the organization to an anti-LGBT group, he says, is perverse. That's Rich Lowry. Then he says, for its most part, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, again, is considered anti-LGBT because it does ask its leader to forswear homosexual acts, but it also wants them to pledge not to engage in heterosexual acts outside of marriage and, for that matter, refuse to use drugs, alcohol, or tobacco. And according to Chick-fil-A, its donation to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes supported sports camps and school programs for inner-city kids, not exactly controversial causes, and his gift to Salvation Army went to youth camps and Christmas presents to thousands of kids in Atlanta, Georgia. Just a couple of examples. And as we've said before, one of the arguments being made even by Dennis Prager is the left is great at destroying, not real good at building up. You know, when I start seeing some of these groups that are anti this, start your own restaurant. We'll see how well you do. Start your own hospital. Start your own outreach to the poor. All you seem to do is criticize. But before we finish at the top of the hour here, I thought I'd get into the piece by Jim Garrity because he's warning us that, you know, you don't want to get too distracted with these culture war politics. And he has some really good points, so I'll try to summarize them fairly quickly. He says, for example, that the editors of the National Review observe that Chick-fil-A faces explicit official retaliation by government agencies for not any incidents of discrimination at stores, but rather for constitutionally protected freedom of expression in its associated foundation, and that's declared intolerable. Then you have, of course, House Ways and Means Committee chairman demanding that the IRS hand over 6 years of Donald Trump's tax returns, ostensibly to prove that the Internal Revenue Service is not properly auditing Trump's returns. Then you have, of course, the latest presidential candidate who is getting a lot of attention. That would be Pete Buttigieg, who challenges Vice President Pence. If you have a problem with who I am, your problem is not with me. Your quarrel, sir, is with my Creator. And he takes on each one of those real quickly, and I will do the same. He said the biggest menace that Chick-fil-A presents to gay Americans is through the long-term threat of higher cholesterol, but Democratic lawmakers behave as if it is must be driven from the nation's airports. But again, he talks about the fact that here is a good example of looking at this issue from ideological blinders, and it's just amazing to me, that argument, which we've already dealt with. So he takes on the second one, and that is the IRS, because he says the IRS is somehow negligent in its duties regarding Trump. He says is implausible. Even if we didn't have existing evidence of partisan passions within the government agency, which, again, are anti-Trump in the government agency. Think this through for a minute. Trump would still be a big and juicy target for any ambitious tax litigator. So to argue that they haven't been actually effectively auditing his returns, seriously? Do you not understand how anti-Trump some of the people in the government are? They'd be coming after him in the IRS even more so. But the other one I'd like to talk about is, of course, the individual getting lots of press these days, and that is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and that's Peter Buttigieg. And in his autobiography, A Shortest Way Home, he says that his relationship with Mike Pence, who, by the way, was the governor, is long and complicated. But interestingly enough, how complicated is it? Because he gives some great background. For example, then Governor Mike Pence tweeted that if he saw a restaurant owner refuse to serve a gay couple, he wouldn't eat there anymore. When asked by a local television station what he thought of Buttigieg's coming out as a homosexual, he said, I hold the mayor, Buttigieg, in the highest personal regard. We have a great working relationship to see him as a dedicated public servant and patriot. And more importantly, Buttigieg has never mustered any examples of Mike Pence, either as governor or as vice president, being rude, hostile, or hateful. But his book talks about the complications of being openly gay in Mike Pence's Indiana. And it's almost like they were looking for some way in which he can denounce the vice president, or back then the governor. But as I think this very good piece points out, the then governor keeps falling down to live up those expectations. So these are just a couple of those issues that you can maybe spend too much time on, and so we won't. But when we come back from the break, if any of you would like to address the culture war issues, and that is the issues, for example, related to Chick-fil-A, we'd welcome your phone calls. But also want to get into many of the other issues. It's about tax time, and we're going to talk about what we've learned about some of the tax issues, and we'll talk about whether or not some have been trying to delegitimize our elections. We'll be right back.
It wasn't long ago it seemed every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands, and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We're talking about Chick-fil-A. We'll certainly take those phone calls. But I did bring up the name Pete Buttigieg, and you might say, okay, who in the world is this? And first of all, he's 37 years of age. He's the mayor, South Bend, Indiana. And you might say, yeah, he doesn't have a chance. Well, he's become kind of the fair-haired boy at the moment. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. That's just kind of the phrase that's used. You know, he is certainly one of those individuals that seems to have captured a great deal of attention. One of the articles, Selena Zito, suggests that he could actually hurt Trump in the Rust Belt. Now, I still have my questions, given the fact that we have what I call a woke primary, where any person that is not intersectional, to use a big word, might have some trouble. So I don't care if you are a white male, but in this case, homosexual, because he is known as being gay, obviously. I mean, he has a husband, which is kind of interesting. By the way, you know, I have people call in every once in a while and say, well, you didn't pronounce that name right. And I recognize that some people say Kamala Harris, but it's Kamala Harris. And whether it's Beto O'Rourke or Beto O'Rourke, well, this is another one, because Buttigieg says, really the way to say my name is Buttigieg. But then his husband says it's Buttigieg, and it's about the same, but, you know, it's slightly different. So even he and his husband, or sex partner, or whatever phrase you want to use, actually say his name differently, but I'll do my best to try to keep the name right. But again, he actually is an individual that has, I think, some potential to beat Donald Trump in the general election. But will he make his way through the primaries? And that's a question, because first of all, he's 37, so he'd be the first millennial candidate to run for president in that regard. He's a military veteran. He's calls himself deeply religious, deeply spiritual, but at the same time, obviously, he's homosexual. He's married to an individual. He enjoys sandwiches from Chick-fil-A, which I thought was kind of interesting, because, you know, the argument is if you're homosexual, then that's just an anti-gay place. And, of course, he's Harvard-educated, Rhodes Scholar, very bright. In just a minute, I'll take on some of this, because over the break we had some conversation. I thought, well, maybe I'll stay on Pete Buttigieg for just a little bit longer, just to, if nothing else, educate you about an individual that, even if he's not the presidential candidate, might become the vice presidential candidate. And the question you might want to put on the table is because he is overtly homosexual, gay, whatever phrase you want to use, would you vote for them, vote for an individual like that, if they were good on the issues? Now, as you'll find out in a minute, he's not good on the issues, on many of the issues we talk about here at Point of View. But before I get too far off of the Chick-fil-A story, let me take some of those calls. So let's go first to Georgia, WLPT. And Mike, I'd love to get your comments about Chick-fil-A.
Sure, thank you. I am retired now. I was a lawyer, and for several years represented the state of Georgia in child abuse and neglect cases in counties in an area in Georgia. And I came upon a case once out of my area where I practiced, my geographical area. I was handling a case for another lawyer, and it was coming up for a review in juvenile court, and there were these two little girls who were in foster care, and I learned that they were in a home funded by Chick-fil-A. The foster parent was there in court. Super nice fella, very educated, very loving man. Said he had a wife and they had kids of their own, and they were foster parents for these two sisters. And he said they get private tutoring paid for by Chick-fil-A. We have horses on our rural farm where we live. If they need braces, we get braces for them.
Wow.
They get counseling paid for funded by Chick-fil-A. And I was not aware of that program, but it surely was a good one. And those little girls were getting a lot of things that a lot of other foster kids couldn't get that were in state-funded foster homes. And just appreciate the work of Chick-fil-A in that regard.
Well, I do too. I mean, when you go through this, and again, I'll go back to some of the comments I had earlier about Chick-fil-A that said, first of all, just the kind of positive things that they have done. And then, of course, you have Salvation Army and thrift shops and aid to the homeless and Fellowship of Christian Athletes, outreach to the inner city kids, and on and on and on. And then to say, we're going to ban this racist, homophobic, anti-LGBT, intolerant group. Sometimes they don't say racist, but they certainly say all the other things. That is just unbelievable to me, because I want to say, well, then what are you doing as an alternative? I like to say to some of my atheist friends, I just haven't seen a humanist hospital lately. I haven't seen, an atheist outreach to the poor. Now, maybe some of those exist. I just haven't run into them. And the other day I'm driving, and you know how you see those signs where it says this area cleaned up by, in this area, I want to, next time I go by there, I'm going to take a picture of it. Actually, they're sponsoring that particular road from the Free Thinkers of North Texas. And I said, that is the first time in a long time I've seen anyone who is always criticizing me, criticizing Christians, criticizing various organizations doing something in a positive way. So sometimes I just want to say, put up or shut up. If you don't like what Chick-fil-A is doing in all these venues, and you don't like what the Buckner Home is doing and all the other organizations in the Salvation Army, what are you doing? Maybe there are a few that are doing some soup kitchens and things like that, but the reality is I will continue to support things like Chick-fil-A because of the good work they do in their community, as well as the fact that they do produce pretty good food. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Mike, and thank you for your service in that regard. That is the kind of thing that I think Christians should be doing, is to help kids in foster homes and to help them that have faced any kind of abuse, trying to put them in a better environment. So congratulations to you for what you've done.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate what you all do.
Well, let's take a break, and I'll take another phone call in just a minute. But I did want to give you a little more information about Pete Buttigieg, and then we'll take some more calls after the break. But as I mentioned, again, mayor of South Bend, Indiana, the first millennial candidate really for the presidency that I'm aware of. By the way, the only Democratic candidate that appeared on Fox News Sunday. That's kind of interesting. And he's already raised $7 million for his campaign. So he may not be quite the fundraiser as Beto O'Rourke or Bernie Sanders, but he's pretty close. And I love what Zena Zetto puts in one of her comments here. The fact that he was born and bred in the American Rust Belt is possibly his biggest asset. He, as a matter of fact, Buttigieg says, our party can and should do better in the industrial Midwest. I'm convinced that so many people in this part of the country are already with us, much more than the other party on issues of substance on policy. I disagree with him, but that's okay. It's his opinion. And if nothing else, it would be a very significant change from Hillary Clinton, who pretty much took Midwestern values for granted and actually might even have ridiculed a few of them on a couple of occasions here. So we will see. But again, one of the big questions is not only his stand on the issues, which are significant and probably very liberal on most of those issues, which we'll get into in just a minute, but also, of course, the fact that he's a homosexual married to a husband. And how would people react to that? Well, we'll see. I'd love to get your comments about that. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Here's an important question. Will the courts determine the future of Obamacare? You might be excused for thinking the Supreme Court already decided that question, but there's another case that may affect the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the bill because of 4 liberal justices and Chief Justice John Roberts. Roberts argued that the mandate in the bill was a tax, and since the federal government has the power to tax, the Affordable Care Act was constitutional. Let's now fast forward to the Republican-controlled Congress when it considered the tax reform legislation known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They didn't eliminate the mandate, but they did zero out the penalty. That's when several states, through their attorneys general, filed suit claiming that the elimination of the tax penalty essentially invalidated Obamacare. Their argument was that removing the individual mandate caused the entire bill to collapse on itself. Back in December, U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor agreed with their argument and struck down both the mandate and the entire law. The case is now making its way through the courts and may eventually end up at the Supreme Court. It is certainly possible that the case won't get that far. Many legal experts believe that it was a huge legal leap for Judge O'Connor to invalidate the entire law, but in an unexpected move, the Justice Department has sided with the federal judge. It's worth mentioning that all of this will be taking place during an election year. Since the Republicans could not agree on a replacement plan when they were in power, that's why Democrats are already making a big issue out of health care during this election cycle. I would highly recommend that some members of Congress start talking about what a replacement might actually look like. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From 20th Century Fox and Franklin Entertainment, Breakthrough, starring Chrissy Metz, based on a true story. Breakthrough, rated PG, in theaters Wednesday, April 17th.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
Hi, this is June Hunt from Hope for the Heart. Kirby and his guests are biblically based, and they bring a conservative voice to today's issues. I want to encourage you to honor this ministry with a special financial gift. You can do that at pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. And Kirby, I thank God for your ministry. You are needed in our world because truth is needed in our hearts.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
June Hunt, again, just wanted to remind you that we had our Truth Team Week last week, and we certainly want to encourage those of you that haven't had a chance to send in your gift to do so, or at least even your pledge. You don't even have to have all the money right now, but if you say, I really believe in what you're doing, but I'd like to support you on a regular basis or even a one-time basis, visit the website, pointofview.net. Thought I'd spend just another minute or two on Buttigieg, because Pete Buttigieg is getting a lot of traction right now. As I said, raised more than $7 million, been on a lot of different talk shows, and his strategy is kind of interesting because on the one hand, he talks about being religious. Now, he's kind of what you might call the religious left, but he's still kind of trying to peel off some people that maybe have religious convictions but have an unease about either the president or the vice president. For example, he said the other day, I'm reluctant to comment on another person's faith, but I just can't believe that the president's actions are actions of someone who believes in God, because I don't understand how you can be worshipful of your own self and not prepared to humble yourself before God. And, of course, we can have a back and forth about where Donald Trump is in his spiritual convictions. You know, we've had James Robison on here saying that even in all the presidents he's known, because James Robison, of course, used to travel with Ronald Reagan, and he knew the Bushes and things like that. He said in his 50 years of ministry, he's never really seen someone more open to prayer. And, of course, a lot of people say, yeah, that's because President Donald Trump needs it. But not only has Buttigieg gone after the president, but he spent a lot of time lately going after the vice president. And I think maybe that's because he's perceived that if indeed he's in the general election, there are a lot of people that even if they have some questions about the persona of Donald Trump, they say, well, but Mike Pence is kind of our guy. You know, he's an evangelical. He's been on, well, programs like Point of View and others, and he's always spoken at various religious groups. He's been at the National Religious Broadcasters and those kinds of things. So he's kind of tried to make this case that the vice president, Mike Pence, has a problem with Pete Buttigieg being gay, as he says. And because he's an evangelical Christian, that's kind of the argument. Well, Amber Atheny, who writes for for the Daily Caller, she's kind of the White House correspondent, said, you know, there's really no evidence that either as the governor, Mike Pence, or now as the vice president, he's done anything other than say very positive things, because the point that he tried to make the other day on one of the Sunday talk shows was, if me being gay, as he said, was a choice, it was a choice that was made far above my pay grade. And that's the thing I wish the Mike Pences of the world would understand, that if you got a problem with who I am, your problem is not with me. Your quarrel, sir, is with your creator. Well, okay, have there been comments by the vice president that in any particular way you would find him to be discouraging, dismissive, rude, in any way at all difficult with the mayor of South Bend, Indiana? And the answer is actually no. There's quite a number of very powerful arguments, some of which I just gave you a minute ago, but I'll give you a couple more just real easy. In 2014, that's when then Governor Mike Pence called then I guess he wasn't mayor. Was he mayor then? I'll have to go look that up for sure. But when he was deployed to Afghanistan, and actually said that Mike Pence was noticeably moved during that particular call. Then in a question when he was in 2015 coming out as homosexual, the comment from then Governor Mike Pence was, I hold Mayor Buttigieg in the highest personal regard. And of course, I read that one before. And then if you look even now in the administration, our ambassador to Germany is Richard Grenell, who is homosexual as well. And it's interesting to see that the ambassador to Germany, who is a homosexual, has made it very clear where he stands on those issues, but actually said, for those of us in the LGBT community who deal in facts, we are chilled by recklessly repeated gossip. Mike Pence is a humble Christian who loves God and all his creation. And so you have story after story after story, quote after quote, saying that the Vice President, Mike Pence, has really been very gracious towards certainly Pete Buttigieg. And even though he's trying to make a big deal about it in some of these talk shows and making a big deal about it in his autobiography, that is not the case. And so as he gains a little more visibility, perhaps we'll bring some others on. Al Perrotta has written a very good piece that appeared in the Stream. It's called Pete Buttigieg, a Pharisee's Attack on Evangelicals and Trump, in which he takes on kind of all the things that the mayor, now presidential candidate, has been saying about a variety of different individuals, including, of course, the president and the vice president and others. And so we might get that on. We'll just see how that goes. But he's somebody who at the moment has really captured a great deal of attention. And so it's worthy of some consideration as well. But I just recognize that a week from today is what? April 15th. What is April 15th? That's tax day. So I thought I might talk about that for just a minute, because some of you are already receiving your tax refunds, and some presidential candidates aren't as well educated, perhaps, as Pete Buttigieg, who was a Rhodes Scholar, went to Harvard. And the one that cracks me up is the other day where you had one of the presidential candidates, Kamala Harris, and a couple others repeated it. So it's not like this was the only time it was said. Matter of fact, it was said in a couple of congressional meetings as well by Democrats, that the fact that individuals this year are receiving lower refunds shows that the tax cuts are a sham. What? you really have to not understand how taxes are paid and tax refunds are paid. So I thought for just a minute, since CBS News felt the need to explain that I would take some time to explain that as well. CBS News, I'm quoting from them, okay? Lower refunds don't mean Americans paid more taxes. Quite the opposite, said CBS News. Again, this is their quote. Most workers paid less in taxes last year and saw higher take-home pay week in and week out. For many Americans, a slightly higher paycheck doesn't quite have the same visibility as a single $3,000 check in March or April. And so what they're pointing out is that really, if you keep getting these checks for $2,000 and $3,000 every March or April, you really need to go back and look at your W-2 forms and things like that, W-4 forms and everything else, and reevaluating how much is taken out, because you're just essentially letting the government deal with your money. And again, Nate Jackson puts it this way. I thought that was a great quote. Far too many Americans treat their tax refunds as a forced savings account for big purchases. Andrew and I were talking about this the other day. CBS notes, while the average refund at $2,800 is only $20 less than it was last year, about 1.6 million fewer people are getting refunds. That means a dip in retail sales for items like appliances or furniture. But now think about this. If you just took that $2,800 and put it into a low-yield savings account at your bank, you get a lot better return on your money than what essentially is an interest-free loan from the federal government. But anyway, I just thought I'd bring it up again. When you hear it once, you go, okay, they maybe just misspoke. I mean, I recognize how exhausting the campaign trail is. Sometimes you get your merds wixed, as I always jokingly say. You say words wrong. You didn't mean it that way, whatever. But when it gets repeated time and time again, even in congressional hearings last week, it happened again. That the evidence that these tax cuts are meaningless are the fact that people are receiving lower refunds. Please. I love CBS News. Two thumbs up for CBS News for saying that lower refunds don't mean Americans paid more taxes. Quite the opposite. They paid less taxes. And if nothing else, as I shared in the last hour when I was talking with Representative Van Taylor, I guess it was 2 hours ago, I did love it in the days when we had people like Professor Dick Armey, Professor Phil Graham. Both were economics professors, one in the House, one in the Senate. It was just nice to know that a few members of Congress understand economics, because it's pretty clear that even some of the people running for Congress and now even some running for the presidency don't understand that just because you got a lower tax refund doesn't mean that you didn't get a tax cut. Oh, well, you can only deal with so much so long. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Question, do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about Medishare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With Medishare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with Medishare, and they actually like Medishare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of Medishare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less, and they like it more. No wonder Medishare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I was going to get to this a little bit earlier, but let me put it on the table real quickly, and that is to talk about taxes. Next Monday is tax day. No doubt some of you have already filed your taxes, and I tried to answer that question that I'll not bring it up again, but it just drives me crazy when I have individuals that you hope would be well educated then go out and make statements on the campaign trail, which, sometimes people misspeak. But then when these statements are being made in the Ways and Means Committee of the House of Representatives, you say, really? Of course, there is no relationship between your tax refund that you receive right now and what your taxes are. I mean, if that were the case, then let's completely rearrange all of our withholding so we get really big refunds, which I think would be a really big mistake. But there's another aspect of that, and that is just to recognize how much you spend your life just simply paying the taxes. And I've talked about this before, but it's been a while. So for especially our new listeners, or even for those of you that heard me and maybe forgot about this, there is what is known as Tax Freedom Day. Next Monday, April 15th, is Tax Day. But Tax Freedom Day happens later. And that is where the individuals that have put this together have taken the entire tax burden and figure out when it's finally lifted off of your shoulders, starting in January, going to, and this time I think it's going to be April 19th. And it's calculated by dividing the official government tally of all taxes collected in each year by the amount of all income earned in each year to figure out when, if you will, that you're no longer working for the government, but you're now working for yourself and the family. Now, of course, you're working for your family every day, but I think it's really helpful to see how far into the year it is before you have that tax burden lifted. Now, what's so interesting is that the Tax Freedom Day will actually occur after the tax day, and the estimate I've been seeing right now, some people have been using is April 19th. We'll see where it actually ends up. But again, that's an average. Now, I recognize that I broadcast in 42 different states. Those of you in Louisiana, you already had your Tax Freedom Day. Those of you in the state of New York, you're going to have to wait till the middle of May for your Tax Freedom Day. So it shows that there is a wide variation, a significant variation, by the way, between even the tax burden that you receive generally as an American compared to what you actually receive depending on what state you live in. So that's certainly one of those things. But before you declare freedom from the government, when you actually have reached Tax Freedom Day, there's a second calculation that I wanted to talk about. And that's what's called the Cost of Government Day. That's the date in which the average American has paid his share of the financial burden imposed by not only spending, federal, state, and local, but also the cost of regulations. Now, that date occurs a few days after the 4th of July. Now, think about this. When you declare independence on the 4th of July, you're almost ready to declare independence from the federal, state, and local governments, taxes, and regulations. Now, this date is a little fuzzier, and I'll be the first to admit it, because, after all, it's a little difficult to calculate all the cost of government regulations, and some of those have been rolled back by the Trump administration, as we've talked about as well. But still, get a sense of some of that the Cost of Government Day, I think, really puts everything in perspective, because it takes more than half the year for you to finally get government off of your back so that you can begin to earn a living for you and your family. And I hope, if nothing else, you would start thinking about this as we get into this in election year, when people start talking about Medicare for all, the Green New Deal. Just a minute, I'm going to talk about a minimum wage, $15 mandatory minimum wage. Cory Booker just introduced legislation that would demand reparations for African Americans, not to mention all the other things like free college and guaranteed annual income. And The list goes on and on. I won't go through that. Some days I like to go through it just to wear you out and show you how much is being proposed. And there's a real good question that you should ask at one of these town hall meetings or campaign meetings. Who's going to pay for all of this? And more importantly, I think when you see things like the Tax Freedom Day or the Cost of Government Day, it helps us understand that there is a cost, but we don't always see it. You know, our taxes are withheld from our paycheck, so we don't really think about what we're paying. You ask the average person, how much did you pay last year in taxes? I just filled my taxes out. What is it? I don't know. I don't have a clue because it's taken out in every paycheck. Imagine the outcry to begin to limit the size and scope of government if next Monday all of us had to pay our taxes in one lump sum. And back to the bigger issue I just mentioned a minute ago, that is you also don't even see the cost of all those regulations. And Donald Trump has tried to reduce those as well. And that may be one of the reasons why you see that the median family income for the first time in about almost 10 years, it's gone up. That black unemployment, Hispanic unemployment, female unemployment is at the lowest levels ever. Jobs are being created and people have a little bit more discretionary income. And some of that has to do with the tax cut. Some of it has to do with the cut in regulations. But just before we take a break, let me talk about a piece of legislation making its way through the House of Representatives. It might be something that you would want to contact your legislators about. It's called the Raise the Wage Act. It actually has passed out of the House Committee on Education and Labor, and it would raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour. Now, it would be in stages, so that is the case, and then it would be actually linked to median income. And this is something which, again, a lot of people have been writing about, and I've got a commentary coming out next week, because this is part of what's called the fight for $15 or the fight for 15. And we've seen this before. As a matter of fact, if you'd like to read about the impact of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour in, for example, the restaurant business in Seattle, where that's already been done, my commentaries that came out this summer are available on our website. But the Wall Street Journal, instead, since they're located in New York, decided to focus on what's happening in New York. And let's be honest, when you actually raise the minimum wage $15 an hour, there are winners and there are losers. The winners are those who receive a bump in their pay. The losers are those who receive a pink slip or aren't even hired in the first place. And they point out that New York City already has been engaged in the same experiment that has been taking place in Seattle. Because for those of you in the New York area listening to this broadcast, you know that starting January 1, or actually December 31st, the New York City raised the minimum wage. And again, because that was done, they found that, interestingly enough, that there seems to be a job recession in full-service restaurants in New York City. They said, well, maybe it's just a coincidence, but isn't it interesting that almost immediately when these workers had to pay $15 an hour, there's a job recession in these full-service restaurants. And employment in January dropped more than 3%. Now, they're just getting the numbers in for February. Looks like it's dropped again. The interesting statistic was that the New York City Hospitality Alliance surveyed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of eateries last year and found that nearly half, 47%, plan to eliminate jobs in 2019 due to higher labor costs, and 3/4 of them said that they plan to cut employee hours. They also point out something I'd never really thought about before, and that is this research paper that found that there was robust evidence that minimum wage hikes increase property crime arrests among teenagers and young adults ages 16 to 24, a population for whom the minimum wages are likely to bind. And the economists provide, I think, some really sobering estimates about the possible increased costs due to property crimes, because if you don't have anything to do, probably going to get involved in some kind of crime. But the last point I thought I'd make just before we take a break is the bill in Congress makes no adjustment for the cost of living. So one of their lines I thought was really telling. They said, so they concluded that a cashier in New York, Texas, population 9, didn't even know there was a city or a town called New York, Texas, but a cashier in New York, Texas cannot be paid a dime less than $15 an hour due to those in New York City. So, interestingly enough, you can see the impact. Yeah, there are winners and losers. Those who keep their job oftentimes get a bump in pay, although sometimes they get a drop in the hours because the testimony that was actually given, interestingly enough, in Congress, in the committee, which was the Education Labor Committee, actually concluded that even those who got a bump in pay made less because they worked fewer hours. So for those that get a bump in pay, maybe they benefit. Many times they don't. But all the others, they get a pink slip or they don't get a job at all. And that's kind of the historic evidence of what happens when you increase the minimum wage. Well, that bill's before your elected representative in the House of Representatives. You might let them know what you think about it. We'll be right back.
Point of View, Truth Team 360.
And in the absence of resources like Point of View and the silencing of the church, I think it would in effect create the silencing of the church. And that's why, again, it is so essential that that forums like Point of View is so vital to the work of the church. And this is where listeners can be an active participant in spreading the gospel of the kingdom by supporting Point of View.
Without programs like Point of View, ministries and works would not have a forum that reaches the populations that need to hear the truth about the very important issues that America is founded on. So often we take what we hear for granted, the radio program or the wonderful personalities. But you know, they can only be on if people like you and me support them.
Point of View. Truth Team 360.
Back once again, and let me just encourage you to consider what you might do to support this ministry. And as you do so, let me just mention, I know you don't give to get, but there are some great benefits. Even at the lowest level, there are Truth Team level, $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year. We send you, of course, our Bible stick. Of course, you get our Outlook magazine. At the higher levels, for example, we also have these booklets. Those of you watching online can see some of the ones I'm holding up here on everything from constitutional interpretation, patriot preachers, archaeology. Most recent one will be arriving very shortly for those of you that have already given to this ministry on anti-Semitism. And, of course, all of that is available to you at different levels, and we encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. Let me talk about elections for just a minute, because it is Election Day in Israel. And then also talk about one of the other articles we've posted here. By the way, when you support this ministry, of course, you're not only supporting the radio program, all the videos we produced, and we have a video we'd like you to watch, but also the articles on the unlawful campaign against Chick-fil-A, the Congressional Prayer Caucus, delegitimizing elections, which I'll talk about in just a minute, and how even a leftist judge is declaring immigration policy. He wasn't elected. I think the president was. Member Congresses were, but this unelected individual is pretty much running immigration policy, so we'll talk about that if we have time. But let's talk about elections for a minute, and that is it's Election Day in Israel. We'll talk more about what that means tomorrow or the next couple of days. You have basically 14 different parties in Israel, and so your citizens really vote for parties, not people, and then they determine the number of those individuals that then actually hold the Knesset, which is 120 seats. Now, no party has ever actually gotten a majority, 61 votes, so 61-seat majority. So there's always some kind of coalition. And so the president, which is pretty much more a ceremonial position, selects the leader who, in his opinion, has the best chance of forming a multi-party coalition. And so that is the case. And, of course, that would be, of course, the prime minister. Now, if indeed his party does well, Benjamin Netanyahu then would be reelected as prime minister. He'd be the longest-serving prime minister in the history of Israel. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out tonight. He, of course, is also facing charges of corruption, so we'll see where that faces as well, and faces pretty strong competition from a coalition of one party that's run by 3 former heads of the army. So we will see where that goes, but if nothing else, we'll put our attention on Israel later in the week as we see what takes place with the election and what kind of coalition is formed and whether or not Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stays in his position. And while I'm talking about elections, one of the articles we've posted here, which I just mentioned a minute ago by David French, it's Stop Delegitimizing Our Elections. And David French, first of all, points out that Donald Trump has been somewhat an abuser of that, in which he attributed his loss of the popular vote to the fact that there were millions of people that voted illegally. Well, that's not true. And even after he made that statement back in 2016, he keeps repeating it. It's just not true. It wasn't true then. It's not true now. But David French, after he obviously takes a very reasonable and legitimate shot at the president, really begins to talk about other individuals who are kind of delegitimizing our elections. Now, on the one hand, I want to be careful because I disagree with the people that say there's no voter fraud. And you've got some that are coming and say, there's no voter fraud. That's just used for voter suppression. That's not true. There are people in jail for voter fraud. There are people that have been fined for voter fraud. So that does take place. But what we're starting to see is people go to the other extreme, saying the reason our people aren't winning is because of voter fraud or voter suppression. And, of course, here's a real easy trick. If our team wins, then there's no voter fraud. If our team loses, then there's voter fraud. And Hillary Clinton has been out saying this. She said, I'm the first person who ran for president without the Protection of the Voters' Right Act. I'll tell you, it really makes a big difference, and not just in Alabama and Georgia. It makes a difference in Wisconsin, where the best studies have been done and said that somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people were turned away from the polls because of the color of their skin, because of their age, because of whatever excuse could be made up to stop fellow American citizens from voting. That claim is breathtaking in its sweep, and completely wrong. Where to begin? I love David French says. Well, first of all, it's been fact-checked by Glenn Kessler at Washington Post. Points out, first of all, the Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965, doesn't apply to Wisconsin. So the premise of a lot of what she said is completely wrong. Really, if you thought 40,000 to 80,000 people weren't allowed to vote, don't you think that there would be front-page stories in the New York Times, Washington Post? This would be a lead investigation by 60 Minutes. Nothing of the sort. And so they basically give her 4 Pinocchios for that. But Elizabeth Warren is out running on the campaign trail as well. And she's making the claim that Republicans stole the gubernatorial election from massive voter suppression. And again, that's a hard case to make, given the fact that an increased number of Georgia voters showed up. Just to put it in perspective for our listeners in Georgia, they're aware of this. In 2014, when Nathan Deal received 103 million votes and won, we can also now particularly talk about Stacey Abrams that received what? Interesting enough, 1.9 million votes and lost. That's because there were 3.9 million people that voted. So voter suppression was not taking place. Voter increase was taking place rather dramatically. And then this whole thing about purge voters, he goes into it in some detail. But again, recognize that Kemp won by almost 55,000 votes. And that nevertheless doesn't stop the Hillary Clintons, Elizabeth Warrens, and a variety of other people that you can read about in this article from making the case that it's voter suppression. And the concern I have is, if we keep having people say this, what you're going to have is even fewer people going to vote, because I've even heard you call into this program saying, what good does it vote? It's a rigged system. No, it's not. And if anything, you need to be an election judge to make sure it's not a rigged system. Finally, one of the other articles I've posted here is something that, again, just illustrates how some of these judges are given the opportunity to overturn laws that have been passed by Congress, or in this case, an administrative policy that's been implemented for the issue of amnesty. And U.S. District Court Judge Richard Seaberg, no surprise, in San Francisco, basically blocked Trump administration policy that would require asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their case is being adjudicated. And whether you think it's a good policy or not, as many of you have called into this program so many times before, how can one judge in Hawaii, in Seattle, in San Francisco block something that's done by this administration? Or even in the past, how could one judge in Texas block Obamacare or block the DAPA program by Barack Obama? There's something seriously wrong with the way this system is working. Our elected individuals in Congress and our elected president are being prevented from doing what they need to do by one judge that they've been judge shopping with. Well, that's all we got for today, so I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow for our Millennial Roundtable. We'll see you then.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your health care. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.